Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a very special episode in the France Country series where we will not be looking at one, not two, not three, but four videos from History Matters on France. These are all as very short videos. They're only 3 to 4 minutes each, and I'll be editing between them so we can watch them all. We're going to be covering up why was France not carved up post-Napoleon, so we're going to be starting from there. Then we're going to be looking at the Paris Commune, which happened right after the Franco-Prussian War, where Paris was overtaken for 2 months, and there was well, you know what? I won't spoil it. We'll get into it. And then finally, life in Alsace, Lorraine, which was annexed by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War, and what was the lives of French people like underneath that. And finally, we'll be ending with the Dreyfus Affair, which was a very, very long affair that had a lot of consequences for French society and the French military. So we're going to get all into those. But first off, let's start up with why wasn't France carved up after Napoleon was defeated, which is a question that I actually had during the recent video from Alternate History Hub of like what could have happened if Napoleon had not have risen to power and how France might have been carved up. So let's see the real reason why it was not carved up. Let's get into that. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Without further ado, let's go.
When you start a major European conflict and get defeated, you'll often lose territory as a result. In 1789, France looked like this. There was soon a lot of warring, one Napoleon, and just over 25 years later, it looked like this. Not a whole lot different. And given the destruction and embarrassment that Europe's other powers suffered at the hands of France, why wasn't it punished more? Why didn't the victorious Allies carve up France?
As
many of you will know, France expanded rapidly in the wake of the French Revolution and peaked at this side.
And actually, even on top of that, it's actually even bigger, really. This is just France proper, if you will, but there's also the Confederation of the Rhine, which had destroyed the Holy Roman Empire and was sort of modeled in a different, sort of amalgamated into different territories. And it extended all the way over to Bavaria, which is around here-ish, right? This is sort of Austria through here. And so it extended even more east than what this map shows. And so France ruled a significant portion of Central Europe and really Europe overall, continental Europe, during this period. So it's even bigger than this map shows.
Naturally, once Napoleon was dealt with, France lost most of its gains but was allowed to keep a few conquests. That was until Napoleon returned. After his second defeat, France lost these territories further. The French border regions were then occupied, whilst the Congress of Vienna, called by the victorious powers to decide what was to be done with France and her allies, was ongoing.
We'll get to that video, by the way.
It was decided that France wouldn't be dismembered or have large swathes of land taken from it and given to anyone else. This wasn't exactly a unanimous decision. The coalition powers fell into two groups. The first was the Punish France camp. This included Prussia, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Savoy, and to a lesser extent Austria, whereas the other powers were in the let's not be hasty camp. This included the United Kingdom, Russia, and unsurprisingly, France itself.
Interesting. So then I guess when you have the two major powers that are on your side for let's not divide this country up, you're probably going to win, right?
This division was something that the French representatives, led by Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, were able to use to France's advantage. Prussia gained this from the Congress. Its original hopes were for this, but Talleyrand was able to convince the British and the Russians to pressure Prussia to accept these lands along the Rhine, which notably included this piece of France proper. This kept the Russians and the Austrians happy, gave Prussia some very rich land to the west, and was exactly what the French wanted. So why? Why willingly give up some of your own land? Because the French were convinced the peace wouldn't last and that these lands would be hard for Prussia to maintain, meaning that in a future war France could win them for itself. This never happened, but it was an interesting idea. The Netherlands and Savoy were also countries which wanted extra lands from France. The Netherlands had hoped for this, but got told that their annexation of the former Austrian Netherlands and rule over Luxembourg would be enough, so shut up. Savoy, despite not doing anything, was given this land at the behest of Austria, who was busy trying to create an Italian confederation much like the German one, which conveniently it would also run. Except that the whole Italian confederation thing fell flat, but it was at least a good effort. Everyone went along with this because the Netherlands and Savoy were supposed to be mid-sized buffer states to keep France contained. And so the only other state that wanted French land was Switzerland.
Wait, so talking about buffer states, I might be wrong on this, and I think I am. You can correct me down below, please. But I think that's the reason that Belgium was created as well, was to have that buffer state between the greater nations. I might be wrong on that, but something along these lines too. So interesting that this buffer state idea was also proposed for after Napoleon was defeated.
Which had hoped to be given all of this. They only got this connecting Geneva to the rest of the country. And the reason was that they had no major powers on their side, since none of them would gain anything from an expanded Switzerland. And so what about the rest?
Switzerland.
Well, for the UK, Russia, and to an extent Austria, there was one primary concern: the balance of power and maintaining monarchical government in Europe. Austria.
And so the thing is, too, is that that's what the Congress of Vienna establishes. And like I said, I'll get into that very long video. I think it's like 50 minutes each part or something. But the balance of power, this actually was really maintained after the Napoleonic Wars until eventually World War I. And so the Congress of Vienna was really successful in doing that. And it makes a lot of sense that you wouldn't want to carve up really a ton of this territory, because it's just going to lead to more conflict, right? I mean, at this point, the monarchs just want stability, and they don't want any more of the instability that France is going to bring. Because, I mean, what if you get a second French Revolution, right? That would have been a complete disaster for all the victorious powers. So cool. Makes a lot of sense, actually.
Austria wanted a strong France to counter Prussia and Britain. Russia wanted a strong France to counter Prussia, Austria, and Britain, and Britain just didn't want to have to deal with the continent anymore. And carving up France meant that no one would get what they wanted. Because if France lost a lot of territory, its recently restored monarchy would probably be overthrown again. It's also the reason why during Napoleon's return, the coalition didn't declare war on France, but on Napoleon. The restored King of France was an ally against Napoleonic and Republican ideals, and thus stealing all of his land afterwards wouldn't have been cool. In the end, it was the coalition's suspicions of each other that meant that France needed to remain strong and unified, meaning that unlike in the wake of other great wars in Europe, major territorial losses were off the table. I hope you enjoyed this.
Cool, yeah. Fantastic. I think that was a great explanation. Let's skip forward a little bit in time here to the Paris Commune. So the French have lost the Franco-Prussian War, and the Paris Commune has been declared. Let's get into that.
The Paris Commune, a short-lived attempt at revolutionary government that for some holds a legendary place in history. Famous for invoking images of French workers taking up arms, establishing their own government, and trying to reforge France in a new image. Its impact was, and is, far-reaching. But despite said impact, the Commune only actually existed for a little over 2 months. Which raises the question, why? Why did the Paris Commune fail? So first, background. In 1870, France was an empire ruled by Napoleon III. There were some disagreements between him and Prussian leadership about who would take the Spanish throne, someone got offended, and because this was 19th century Europe, that meant war. The French did not perform.
And that's a sad thing, is that so many, and this is kind of, sort of what happens for World War I, how the world leaders at this time sort of sleepwalk into, at that point, the greatest conflict in human history, where honor, right? Honor plays a big role into this, and as well as sort of keeping the societal ties and, you know, everything that thankfully, although isn't completely gone from our modern society, you know, people getting offended and starting wars doesn't really happen as much, I know.
Performed well in this war, and Napoleon III himself was even captured. And about 6 seconds after this, France's remaining leaders declared the creation of the Third French Republic, but still continued the war. The Prussian army now marched on Paris and placed the city under siege in mid-September of 1870. The city was
Also, if you want to know more about this, go check out the last video I did on the Franco-Prussian War by the Armchair Historian. I'll leave a thing in the top right here.
mostly defended by the National Guard, a voluntary militia made up of the Parisian working class. Many of its members were unhappy with the government and wished for more representation and better economic conditions for them if they were expected to fight and die. They were given, to use a technical term, squat, and despite many protests and increasing radicalisation, the representatives of the French Republic remained in charge there, and in January 1871, the city's leaders surrendered. The French held an election, and the pro-peace monarchists won. And as such, many in Paris feared the return of the monarchy. Not Napoleon III, though. Thrones are for winners. With the war now over, the French government sought to disarm all of those radical members of the National Guard. And so they came up with an ingenious idea. They asked politely, and in return promised not to shoot them. Shockingly, the National Guard said no, and when the army moved in to seize their weapons, some fighting broke out, many Parisians sided with the National Guard, and the government and army fled the city.
And notice here that Alsace-Lorraine is under German control, which will be the next video.
And on March the 18th, the Paris Commune was declared. It held elections soon after, which were open to most Parisians, providing they were men, and a new ruling council for the city was placed in charge. Most of these were radically left-wing, with many being socialists or communists, but about a quarter were moderate right-wing candidates.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I had a thought that this was all sort of like a Jacobin council, how everyone was on the same side here. I didn't know that there was actually moderates in it too.
However, due to increasing radicalisation, many of the right-wing members of the council left, and some even fled the city.
Okay,
in fact,
there you go. That wasn't long.
This diversity...
New Jacobins. Okay, perfect. New Jacobins, Blanquists, the First International. Cool. Independent Socialists, Anarchists. Okay. Moderate Republicans.
Leadership which made running the Commune difficult.
Yeah.
Unlike later revolutions, there
Because
was
so many people are trying to all band under the same banner, and then they disagree, and then it's like a snake eating itself. And we've seen that time and time and time again throughout history.
no definitive leader nor much of a clear agenda. However, the primary debate of legislators was over whether or not the revolution was to be spread elsewhere or shored up in Paris first. In Versailles, not too far away, the freshly fled Republican government was deciding on how nice to be with the revolutionaries, and the conclusion they came to was not very. The communards were little more to the government than a violent coup led by poor militiamen, and such events could never be allowed to slide if this government was to survive. And in this opinion, they had the backing of most of the country. The Commune had fairly broad support in Paris, but nobody really knew what their endgame was. And this is an important reason why it would soon fail. But how exactly did it fail?
No.
Well, its end came when it was crushed militarily. The communards decided mostly that sitting in Paris was waiting to be crushed, and so decided in April to march on Versailles. They were clearly outgunned by the French army, but they banked on the common soldiery joining them as they marched on Versailles. Now, the military tactic...
Oh, wait, that was a... Oh, my... Wait.
They banked on the common soldiery joining them as they marched...
Oh, that's a fantastic reference. So this is a reference to the first Age of Empires, where the priests, you could go and then you could convert your enemy's units into your units. Oh, that's one of the reasons why I love this channel. It's a little jokes in there that sometimes you miss, but if you know, you know.
Marched on Versailles. Now, the military tacticians amongst you will know that fighting a war based on the premise of it's fine, they probably won't shoot back isn't the most sound strategy, and it was not. As a side note, whilst all of this was going on, there was a massive German army camped outside the city.
Yes.
The reason that they were there was that in the peace negotiations, in return for not storming the city, the French would give the Germans, to use a legal term, fat stacks of cash. And since the people of Paris hadn't paid up, there they waited. Anyway, a couple of weeks after the failed march on Versailles, the French army launched an assault on Paris. This assault is known as Bloody Week, because it saw the French army systematically eradicate most resistance and undertake the mass execution of any suspected communards. Most communard leaders fled the country, and the government began the long process of re-establishing control over the city. And so, like most small revolutions, the Paris Commune failed because it was crushed militarily. And part of the reason why that could happen was because of the fragmented leadership of the Commune. There was no central leader, nor any overriding idea of what the communards wanted France to look like. And with that, there was no decisive action taken against the Republican government even when it was at its weakest. Nor was there any central ideology for anyone outside of Paris to rally around and help them. I hope you...
So I wonder then in that point of why does this commune in particular sort of stand out as much it does even to this day? I understand that within the context of French history it's very important, but I've seen, like I remember when I went to university there was like a Marxist club or whatever. I've talked about that before, but they had posters on the Paris Commune and they had like talks about the Paris Commune and stuff like that. So, I mean, it sounds like it was kind of just a failure. Okay, I guess maybe it's the first of its kind, therefore it's the most special, but okay, maybe there's some details here that were missed, but still, nonetheless, while the Paris Commune was going on, people in Alsace, Lorraine, which was then just freshly annexed by Germany, were obviously still living there, French civilians who now found themselves living in Germany. And so what was their life like under the Germans? Let's find out in the next video here.
The unification of Germany in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War changed Europe forever. Its creation importantly involved the annexation of the region known as Alsace-Lorraine, or Elsass-Lothringen in German, which permanently damaged Franco-German relations. When thinking about Alsace-Lorraine, there is one question that is seldom asked. What was life like for the French people who already lived there? By French, I simply mean the people who lived in France prior to the annexation, not French-speaking people, since in these areas German was the dominant language.
Interesting, I didn't know that. So I wonder if that's still the case to this day. I know in Strasbourg you can still, like there is a bit more German speakers there, but I don't think that many. But I mean, I was also in Sibiu recently, which is in Romania, used to be known as Hermannstadt, and they still have a small German-speaking minority there. And that was, I mean, that was annexed after after the empire fell, well, annexed, but you know, that was taken away from Austria after the empire fell more than 100 years ago. So I wonder what it's like today.
That said, whilst the majority of the annexed territory spoke German, that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted to join Germany. For the Germans, there was a lot of debate over what was to be done with their new territory. It was decided that the territory would be centrally run from Berlin as what's called a Reichsland, meaning that the Kaiser held direct authority there, although he did act through a governor. At first, Alsace-Lorraine had zero input into its own affairs, but by 1879 it had been granted some concessions. So for the average French person who lived
Almost 10 years later
in the region since before 1871, what changed? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the people living there were given a choice. Leave within a year or become Germans, and of the 1.5 million inhabitants there, about 50,000 people left for France.
That's it. Really, only 50,000 people actually left. Huh, that's quite small, really.
The overwhelming majority of Alsace-Lorraine's population was Catholic, and it now being ruled mostly by the Protestant Prussians meant that there were going to be tensions. In the end, Catholics were barred from higher education, and their newspapers were heavily censored. This
Nice.
meant that from then on, the Catholics would have an extremely strained relationship with the German government. Hence why it's incorrect to boil resistance to German rule down to little more than Frenchmen not liking it. Whilst the cultural shock of being ripped away from France was unquestionably severe, the economic hit was absolutely massive. For example, Alsace produced more cotton textiles than the entirety of Germany combined in 1871.
Really?
And it now being cut off from France meant that they had no more customers, and that German textiles now faced tremendous competition. This competition to German textiles was so bad, it was proposed that in order to mitigate this, Alsace be given to Switzerland instead, but
What?
the Kaiser said no. So after 40 years was the region fully integrated? Not really. Whilst the region had gained some autonomy over the years, its people wanted more. In 1913, German soldiers insulted the local population using the term Wackers, a derogatory term for the people of Alsace-Lorraine, in what's called the Zabern incident. This led to protests, and the Kaiser Wilhelm II subsequently sided with the soldiers, which basically destroyed any loyalty the region had to the empire.
Congrats.
When the First World War broke out a year later, sympathies for
I'm really not a fan of Kaiser Wilhelm II. There's some sort of like weird online sort of movement to rehabilitate his image, but really not a fan of him.
France remained high. As such, army conscripts from Alsace-Lorraine were sent to the Eastern Front so that their divided loyalties would be tested. Furthermore, speaking French in public was banned, and the people of the region were treated poorly since the government was worried about pro-French spies. And ultimately, after French victory in the First World War, the region was returned to France, and the issue over who owned it was totally settled forever. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, and so obviously, World War II. I mean, come on. Though that's interesting because, when you get really annexed, I mean, you're completely annexed. Your passport changes, your identity that's based around the nation that you live in is completely different. And so I can only imagine like what that experience would be like, to that even though you speak the language of the country you now belong to, that's not your nation, right? It's like if Canada, right, if we were just annexed by the United States, like, yeah, sure, we speak English, but I'm a Canadian, right? I'm not an American, and I feel very strongly about being a Canadian, as you can hear by the way I say about, but, despite that fact, that the nationhood that's really, in a lot of people is probably very strong. And I can only imagine that as relations went worse and worse, that was really, your nationality is really tested. Cool. Let's end this here on the Dreyfus Affair, an event that I don't really know too much about, but I do know that it has some obviously important consequences for French society and for the French army as well. So, hey, let's get into that one.
The late 19th century was pretty rough for France. It was already on its third republic, its politics were incredibly divisive, and it had suffered numerous foreign policy embarrassments, the most famous being France's catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Prussians, which led to the creation of the new German Empire, which now included the former French region of Alsace-Lorraine. France wanted this back, and the reclamation of Alsace-Lorraine became a national priority for every French government. This was easier said than done though, since Germany was a powerful nation with a larger population, larger economy, and an army to match.
True. And so the other thing too is that with the reunification of Germany, and arguably the hastening of the reunification of Germany, whether it would have happened anyways, that's up for debate, is that Germany at this point is now the most powerful country in Europe. The most, hands down. It's not even debatable. And so this obviously terrified the rest of Europe and made Germany an incredibly powerful force to be reckoned with.
This led to a paranoid culture which despised and feared the Germans in equal measure. This fear of Germany led to France investing a great deal of money and effort into its military, and this involved the creation of new weapons. The problem was that somebody in the French army was leaking the schematics of these weapons to the Germans.
Okay.
A French spy then found a rip note in the German embassy detailing French artillery schematics and reported it. Now, obviously, the French army was pretty keen to find and punish the man responsible. The Minister for War ordered an investigation which started by focusing on those who worked in the artillery corps and those who may be sympathetic to Germany. And the man they found was Major Alfred Dreyfus, an artillery officer born in the recently lost territory of Alsace-Lorraine whose first language was German. He was arrested in late 1894 and put on trial. There was no evidence and the prosecution relied on character assassination.
Yeah.
In fact, the only evidence they had, the note, didn't match Dreyfus's handwriting, and so they argued that he intentionally used a different handwriting style to fool them. In the end, Dreyfus was found guilty of treason and sentenced to be imprisoned in French Guiana. Of course, the main problem was that Dreyfus was innocent. The trial and subsequent verdict weren't very well known in France until 1896, when the head of French military intelligence discovered that Dreyfus wasn't the man giving information to Germany, but instead it was a certain Major Ferdinand Esterhazy. Esterhazy went to trial in 1898, but since the French High Command had already convicted Dreyfus, they didn't want to look silly, and so he was found not guilty and pressured to resign, which he did, and then lived out the rest of his life in England. This was obviously a bit of a scandal, but things came to a head when Émile Zola, a well-respected novelist, wrote a headline article accusing the French government of imprisoning Dreyfus simply because he was a convenient scapegoat. And he argued that the primary reason this happened was that Dreyfus was Jewish. You see, France, like much of Europe, had been going through a bit of an anti-Semitic phase for the past 2,000 years, and so Dreyfus...
Yeah, and that's another thing too, is that within the... Obviously, this is before World War II, or even before the First World War, but anti-Semitism throughout Europe is obviously very, very well documented in places like France, and pretty much everywhere in Europe had bouts of anti-Semitism, and it was really peaked during the early 20th century and late 19th century was when, not at its all-time high, because I don't know if that's true, but it was certainly one of the peaks in the last century or 2 centuries or so of anti-Semitism in Europe. And yeah, that ultimately culminated in the Holocaust itself.
Dreyfus got little sympathy. Zola's article sparked public outcry, and the nation, already bitterly split down political lines, was embroiled in a new fierce national argument over Dreyfus and over anti-Semitism in France. Those who sided with Dreyfus, the Dreyfusians, were often liberal-leaning Republicans who cherished the French principles of equality and justice. Those who sided against him were often conservative Catholic monarchists who saw the military as an incorruptible bastion of stability and honour.
A nice, perfect divide to really, spice up society, if you will.
When Zola himself was tried and imprisoned, things got more radical and many Dreyfusians coalesced around the Socialist Party. In 1899, France's Supreme Court ruled that Dreyfus had been unlawfully convicted, and so he was returned to France, where he was promptly arrested by the military and put on trial for conducting espionage against France on behalf of Germany and found guilty. This time, the French High Command were prepared and had opted simply to forge evidence against Dreyfus. To put it mildly...
Very nice. So if you can't convict a man the first time, just remember to forge evidence so that you can convict him the second time.
There was a lot of anger on both sides, and France was plagued by widespread anti-Semitic riots.
Yeah.
There was also international outcry as nations like Italy and Britain fiercely condemned French justice as a sham, whereas Germany said nothing, oddly enough. The French president wanted to put an end to all of this, and so he pardoned Dreyfus in 1899 on the condition that he admit his guilt. Dreyfus, having spent years away from his family, just wanted it all over with, and so he did so. And after this, you'd think that everything would be sorted, but fun fact, no. In 1905, a report was published about the affair, which condemned the French military's forging of evidence, as well as the bit where it let the real culprit go. This led to the French president quashing all charges against Dreyfus, rehabilitating his reputation and reinstating him in the army. Dreyfus soon after left the army because, obviously, and one would assume that he'd hold a grudge against the institution that had falsely imprisoned him. Yet, when World War I broke out, he went back to service and fought at the Battle of Verdun, which was more than many had...
One of the bloodiest battles in World War I history, by the way, but we'll get to that. Epic History TV's World War I series is up next.
...expected of him. I hope you enjoyed this.
Wow, what a character. So the fact that literally your nation drags you through the dirt and imprisons you twice for something you didn't do, and arguably because of your own heritage, and you still go to fight for that nation when the time is necessary. Yeah, come on. What, like really an amazing character to still be able to go through that much conflict and still fight for your nation when the time is necessary. I hope you all very much enjoyed those History Matters videos. Those are just a couple of the ones. And we've at this point now where the next videos we'll be getting into is Epic History TV's World War I. That will probably be a 3-part video. I think the video is around an hour long or so. And yeah, massive conflict, one of the most important in French history, and that's the one that's up next. Thank you all very much for joining me so far. I hope you're enjoying the France Country series. Take care, and I'll see you guys in the next video.